Welcome, Stephen. Let's talk about your journey from atheism to your faith in Jesus through science. Can you start by maybe sharing how you grew up with your relationship with God?
Yeah, so I was born and raised in a small Mississippi swamp town. And I like to describe Mississippi as the buckle in the Bible Belt. Even now, about 85% of people in Mississippi attend church regularly. And my family was in church every Sunday morning for Sunday school, every Sunday morning for services. When I was old enough to go to youth group, I was in church every Sunday night for youth group. I was in church every Wednesday night for Wednesday night church. So we were very much involved in church. It was a big part of my life. And when I was 16, I even gave the sermon on Youth Sunday.
Wow.
And when I was 16, right before the sermon, I actually left home and went away to school. So I went to a state-funded boarding school called the Mississippi School for Mathematics and Science for high school juniors and seniors who are obviously wanting to pursue a career in math and science. Or nowadays, we probably call it STEM, but back then it was just math and science. Our church never had any issues with science and religion. It was Presbyterian. Our pastor at the time, he had a doctorate in divinity, never science versus religion. It was never an issue. But while I was gone, shortly after I left for the Mississippi School for Mathematics and Science, the life of my youth pastor back home just completely collapsed. Now, I didn't witness it firsthand, so I only know what I was told. But within a few months, his wife had left him. They were divorced. She remarried less than a year later. And as a divorcee, he couldn't find work in ministry. He ended up selling insurance with his father and left ministry altogether. He's since come back, but this was, 30 years ago. And it hit a lot of us very hard because he was our youth pastor. We were very close to him. Here, his life just completely dissolved through what seemed like no fault of his own. And so I and a lot of other people really asked, well, how could God let that happen? I came to the conclusion that either God didn't care or that God didn't exist. Now, there's actually a third possibility, which is God knows better than I do. But in my youthful arrogance, I was really not smart enough to get that third part. So I came to the conclusion that God was just a delusion made up by people who needed it as a crutch to kind of get through life. And I spent several years taunting, all the Christians around me. I had a copy of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy that was leather bound and looked like a Bible. And I'm sure that was intentional from the makers. The author was famously an atheist. And I would wave that around and say, things like, I have real knowledge for you right here, useful things, in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And so, I went off to college and worked in a physics lab and programmed the data analysis on their computers. And as I learned more science and learned more about science and this philosophy of science, I realized you can't prove a negative. So there's an old principle in science that says absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So I may not have had evidence for God, but that certainly isn't equal to me disproving the existence of God. So I moved from atheist to agnostic, and I kind of flip-flopped a little bit back and forth between those two. So then I end up in graduate school. I think it's my first year in graduate school. So this is probably around 1996-ish. I am an agnostic, but, atheist-leaning agnostic. And I go into a lecture one day for quantum mechanics, and the professor had a tendency to yell out, "Hail Odin," when he had finished a particularly clever mathematical derivation. And he would say, well, I worship the ancient Norse gods, so it's okay for me to say this. Now, everybody knew he was an atheist, and he just did this to taunt, Christians in the room. And finally, one of the Christians in the room, after he'd been doing this for a while, right at the start of class, she raises her hand and she says, "Excuse me, but could you tell us about fine tuning? I had never heard of fine tuning before. So, and I'll talk more about it in just a minute, but the professor came around to the front of his desk, and I think he sat down on the desk or something, and he looked at the classroom and said, okay, look, we have to be honest. The laws of physics are so extremely specific mathematically, they absolutely look like they were intentionally created because the odds of just having them all come together like that is just astronomically small. So, yes, the universe, or at least the laws of physics, look created. He said, but there's something called the anthropic principle that says that since we can only live in a universe where the laws of physics make it possible for us to exist, none of this means anything. And so, I thought about that a little while. A couple days later, I ran into him outside of class and I said, look, I've been thinking about this. And really, the anthropic principle isn't really a very good rebuttal to why we exist because it kind of seems like a cop-out. He said, okay, yeah, you're right. He said, we don't know yet why the universe exists. We don't know. And he said this, he said, but I like to think that the idea of the universe is so compelling that it must exist, but we don't know why it exists. And he ran off. And so I started thinking, so this is, a PhD quantum physics professor who's an atheist, whose best argument against God is that the idea of the universe is so compelling that it must exist. Well, doesn't an idea imply that there's a mind in which the idea exists? And he gave me such a compelling argument for God without himself even knowing it. So I started looking for that creator, and I studied a lot of different religions. And finally, an old friend of mine, I'd actually been his assistant when I was an undergraduate, and he was working at the National High Magnetic Field Lab at the time. And we ran into each other, and he said, hey, how are things going? And I told him about all this stuff. And he said, well, I want you to read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I said, okay. And he made me promise, and I did promise. And I bought the book, and it sat on my shelf for probably 2 or 3 years. And then one day, I don't know if it was a rainy day or what, I had nothing to do. I just picked it up on a whim and I never put it down until I finished it. And what that book showed me is that the values of Western civilization are founded on Christianity. There are no better values than love God with all your being and love your neighbor as your very own self.
Amen.
Loving another person is a sacrifice for them that you do not benefit from. And that's exactly what God demonstrated in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so from that point, I was on my Christian journey. And I already knew more or less the contents of the Bible. But since then, of course, I've read the entire Bible a couple of times. I've studied quite a substantial amount of human history. And God is there. In the laws of physics, God is there throughout all of human history, and God is there in our own hearts and in the stories that we have, the personal stories that we have. But he's not only in the personal stories. He's there in the physics, and he's also there in the history.
Amen. I love that. I love hearing that story. I want to have you touch on a couple of common arguments that you get from atheists. But before we do that, I've heard myself from atheists, that with the advents of science, there's no need for God anymore, that it's disproved God. Can you touch on how you would respond to that kind of statement?
Sure. There are 2 concepts that I get a lot on social media from atheists that they do not understand. The first is that the Big Bang is a derogatory term to try and undermine the idea, because at the time the Big Bang was proposed by a Christian, most scientists believe the universe had no beginning and would have no end. And it was not popular to say that the universe had a beginning because that was too much like the Bible. The other misconception is when they use the term God of the gaps. God of the gaps is a theological concept from Christians from the 1800s that says that the God of the Bible is the God of all creation. He's not just the God that fits into the gaps where our science doesn't understand how things work. That's fundamentally different from the concepts of Ra, the concepts of Zeus. In the Judaic pre-Christian era, the sky was a divine creature, right? The Bible in the book of Genesis is the first time in humanity's history that someone had articulated that the universe is a mechanistic thing. That's not what anyone else at the time believed. Now we all believe that, atheists and Christians alike, but that wasn't the case in ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Greece or Rome or in ancient Egypt. And so the idea that we don't need God anymore, one, we need God because we're flawed, right? That's the biggest reason we need God. But if you're looking for evidence that the universe is created, the biggest evidence of that is simply that all that stuff that was in the Big Bang didn't want to be there. That's why it exploded. If it didn't want to be there, how did it get there? Physics has no answer and can never have any answer for that. It's the same thing when you're looking at the fine tuning, which I mentioned a minute ago. Lots of people talk about the ratios of fundamental constants, gravity to, electromagnetism or something. And those are good arguments. My background is in making little universes inside the computer where I controlled the laws of physics, and I did phase transitions. So we're looking at simulations of phase transitions. It's a branch of physics called statistical mechanics, or sometimes called condensed matter. I won't get into the details of how physics is organized. But when you look at phase transitions, and of course we all know about like liquid, solid, gas, but there's actually millions and millions of different kinds of phase transitions all around us. Superconductivity is a phase transition. It turns out that when you're looking at the math, we can go in the computer or go on paper and we can adjust the number of spatial dimensions. We can go into 2 dimensions. Well, crystals can't exist in 2 dimensions. There's not enough degrees of freedom. You go up above 4, you start to go into 5 dimensions and higher. Almost all phase transitions don't exist anymore. You get into something where everything kind of looks samey at the atomic level. Why are phase transitions important? Phase transitions indicate a complexity in the interactions of atoms and molecules together. And that complexity is necessary for things like metastability and for complexity. That complexity, if it doesn't exist, you don't get life. The sweet spot where you get the most complexity and phase transition possibilities, guess how many spatial dimensions?
3? I don't know.
3.
Okay.
It's 3. Out of how many possible spatial dimensions in the math? Infinity.
That's
so
amazing.
The odds of just that one parameter, literally 1 out of infinity. Now, there are other mathematical aspects to physics which make it even less likely. So the odds of having a universe where life is even possible by the laws of physics is literally less than 1 out of infinity. That's a countable infinity if you're a math nerd listening to this. That's how unlikely it is that a universe where life could exist is possible. There's something in physics called spontaneous symmetry breaking. Whenever we take pure energy in the lab and that gets converted into matter, we always end up with matter and antimatter, which then, when they combine again, go back into energy. Our universe appears to be made only of matter, not antimatter. That's very confusing how that happened. There are lots of other things. The biggest is how on earth does non-life go into life? The odds of that happening just by a random process of assembling all the molecules correctly is so low that if you saw it happen in a lab, it would be absolutely scientifically and mathematically indistinguishable from a miracle. The odds are so low, it's a 1 with 4,500 zeros. You know how many atoms are in the universe? A 1 followed by only 82 zeros.
Wow. That's incredible.
It's incredible. And now it's not only that, it's then what are the odds of developing multicellular life, intelligent life? Someone on my page asked me a couple days ago about the Fermi paradox, and I've recorded a post, but I haven't posted it yet. Have you heard of the Fermi paradox?
Never.
So the Fermi paradox is really a question posed by the famous physicist Enrico Fermi. And he said this, he said, if it's easy for non-life to develop into life, if it's easy for life to evolve into intelligent life, where on earth are all the aliens? Because in our galaxy alone, there's 100 billion stars. Our planet is 5 billion years old, but our galaxy is probably over 10 billion years old. That's a lot of time and space for aliens to have developed. And yet we have zero evidence for those aliens. And even though our galaxy seems large, it's 100,000 light years on a side, which, is an unfathomable amount of time for us to travel that. For a civilization that's 1 million years old, billions of years old, that's not a very large distance. And so you look at these things and you look at the evidence and you go, well, gosh, you know what? I think God made us special. And if he made us special, I bet he loves us very much. There's nothing in science to conflict with that. And we're not arbitrarily special, like the shape of a snowflake. We are special in a meaningful way.
Wow. I love that. And, you obviously are speaking above my head on a lot of these things. In The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, they were giving the analogy that a hurricane would have to go through a junkyard and put through a fully functioning 747 with lights and, everything to be the equivalent of something that could happen. Like it's impossible. And like you said, I love how you said it. It's impossible. And if it happens, it's a miracle.
Yeah. And there's a lot of that. When you look at the odds of something happening, what I like to tell people is if the odds of something happening are so small that you would never expect to see it, not even in the entire time and space of the universe, if you do see it, it's scientifically indistinguishable from a miracle. Is it a miracle? That's a different conversation, but it's indistinguishable from a miracle. And there are lots of those that exist in our world. We will never know, for instance, are there other universes? We can't know because by definition, a universe cannot interact with another universe because they are separate. So the alternative explanation to the universe being created is usually the multiverse, that actually everything exists. That doesn't mean God doesn't exist. The real kicker, though, with these two explanations of a creator being or the multiverse is that both of these require you to believe that something exists outside of our universe that you will never see, you will never touch, and you can never demonstrate in a lab to exist. One of those has millions of people who talk about interacting with that every day. And the other one has no evidence whatsoever. God's been around us for a very long time. And the more you look at history and the more you look at the world, the more obvious it is. Values matter. All the best countries in the world are Christian countries, and all the worst countries are not Christian countries. The most atheist country in the world is North Korea. That's not a nice place to be. Before that, the most atheist countries were Red China and the Soviet Union. Neither one of those were great places to be. The most Islamic countries are not great places to be. Now, Japan is probably the only non-Christian nation that's a decent place to be. But remember, they were wildly brutal until the U.S. occupation after World War II. They are predominantly atheistic. They're not as atheistic as North Korea.
So to the atheist who's watching right now, what would you say?
Atheism has no values. It doesn't tell you how to live. And your choice is to either make something up yourself, or you can go with the values that underlie the most amazing civilization in the history of humanity, which is Western civilization. Abandoning those values has never led to anything good. It has only led to depression and woe.
I've also heard a rebuttal to science explaining away God, said that the role of science isn't to cover the supernatural. That goal of science is a repeatable event that you can study and make sure that's consistent outcomes. Would you also agree with that statement?
That's absolutely true. There's tons and tons of scientists who are Christian and Jewish and Muslim. And although we may not agree on what the revelation is from God, we all certainly agree that science doesn't disprove God, because that's not what science is about. Science isn't about the search for truth or proof or any kind of absolute knowledge. In fact, if you use those words in graduate school, and I did a few times, you get your wrist slapped because those are dirty words. Science is not about the search for truth. It's not the search for anything that's absolute. In fact, we don't call any of our scientific explanations anything other than theories. Gravity is a theory. It's a theory because it's to indicate to us that we don't have all the answers.
Can you talk a little bit about, because I think people get confused, atheism versus agnosticism?
So I think of it as a spectrum. So you've got atheists who say there is no God. They have an active belief that God does not exist. An agnostic says, well, look, I can't have evidence that something doesn't exist. And so I really just am saying there might be a God, there might not be a God. I haven't seen enough evidence to say there is or isn't a God. So there's a neutral position. Deists are people who believe in usually it's a generic creator God. Deists often believe that all religions are made up by people. And then, of course, there's Christians and Jews and all the other religions that are on the other end of the spectrum past deism.
Is deism the clockmaker who kind of wound the world and sits back and doesn't have any interaction with the world? That's deism?
Yeah, that's
Okay, I've heard of that. So for somebody watching who maybe has an atheist or even agnostic son or daughter, or they've got a friend they want to share Jesus with, what would you say is the best way to do that?
So most of these people, if they grew up in the church and they've walked away from God, it's up to God to open their eyes and open their ears. Otherwise, they're not going to hear the message. So yes, it's fine to share the message, but you have to be aware that they're probably not going to be able to hear it. It's kind of like witnessing to a person who's deaf and blind. They're not going to hear. And so the best thing you can do is simply represent God's love for them in their life. That's really the best thing you can do, and pray for them, of course, because it's up to God to lead them to himself. And some people he comes back for. Jesus talks about the good shepherd who leaves the 99 and comes back for the one. I was that one. And there are many, many atheists who absolutely believe in God, but they have walked away from God out of anger. A large percentage of those people that I get on my pages, on my social media pages, actually desperately want to come back to God. They don't always know it, but I believe most all of them desperately want to come back. But what's preventing them from coming back is usually their own arrogance and their own pride. And God has certain ways of removing our pride and our arrogance. And those are not pleasant ways. Those are not pleasant things. It's usually bad things that happen to us in our lives or poor decisions we make, and we realize that our values matter. So patience, love, prayer, I think those are probably the best things that someone can do if there's an atheist in their life. I know for a fact that when I was an atheist, Christians were praying for me because they told me they were praying for me. And I scoffed and I laughed, but here I am now. Prayer works.